Let's get started. And hopefully we do have some folks join as we go. And you guys have been on pivot sessions before, so you know we do these every Tuesday at 10 a.m. We've got some cool ones coming up as well. Next week is actually on inclusion in the workplace. So looking forward to that. But let me introduce our two speakers. I think you guys both know, Curt and Rachel. And let me share with you, they together have 50 years of global management experience. So a lot of lessons learned, a lot of scars, but a lot of very cool things to teach you in terms of best practices. Rachel is the Assistant Director of Programs at the Brink and truly has a passion for social innovation. And Curt Becker is one of our advisors, and Curt is truly a life science pioneer, has created businesses from scratch and managed teams, and done some very, very cool stuff, which I'm sure he'll be sharing more about today. So that's our lineup for today, talking about goal setting and project management. So without further ado, I'm actually going to stop sharing. And Curt, if you want to share your screen now, go right ahead. And as you guys heard, Rachel is traveling our beautiful country in an RV, so her internet is going to be a little spotty today. So we do have some things pre-recorded that we'll share along the way. And since it is a small, intimate group, please feel free to come off mute when you have questions and we can talk, but I will watch the chat in case there's something you want to write down. Okay, Curt, you're on.
Thanks. Thank you for the kind introduction, Lauren. And yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I brought up the concept of the SWOT analysis, opportunities and threats, and definitely, opportunities and strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And definitely the opportunities and threats are things that are going exterior to our company that we really don't have any control of. And certainly as we talk about pivots, the pandemic is the main driver. And I'm going to be focusing on that today. And I think the pandemic gives us an opportunity. Well, usually our businesses grow organically, and they are not well planned. We do we try to address what's in front of us at the moment. And I think the pandemic actually gives us an opportunity to go back and really get a hold of some basic management principles and implement them into our company. So let's take a look at that. And I'll start with talking about SMART goals that you may or may not have heard of, but these are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed. And this is a process that should take place across a whole company, and it depends on about how big you are. I'm going to kind of put this in the context of a larger company now, but if you start here and be thinking about these principles and concepts now, you'll be in better tune with growth and achieving your goals as you go down the road. So, so these kind of performance management SMART goals should start the planning process. Every company should have a planning process. What are we going to do over the next year? And these should be well defined. Okay, so the corporate goals mostly are going to be owned by the CEO, and they may be negotiated between the CEO and the board of directors or something like that. But the CEO can have their own goals, SMART goals, but then we have to look at all the people who report into the CEO and align some SMART goals with the CEO's goals. So let's just give an example here: to grow sales by 50% over the next year. Okay, so how are you going to do that? You know, and I have worked in organizations, very successful organizations, eventually, where they just, said, we're going to go out and grow 15%, and then, sales was like, well, how the hell are you going to do that? And R&D is what's our role within that? And guess what? It didn't work out very well. It caused a lot of turmoil, and maybe some backstabbing and things like that. And we didn't reach those goals. So defining those a little bit better through the SMART goal system, we can say, how do you grow your business? You can expand your product line, which is mostly going to impact R&D and manufacturing, but it will impact all the different departments within the company. Maybe you're going to move into a new geography, and that will affect primarily, probably, marketing and facilities, expand into new market segments. And that's a marketing function. Expand sales channels, so rather than just selling maybe with boots on the ground, going into more e-commerce types of approaches to sales. But all of these ideas of, okay, we're going to grow our sales, now let's define how we're going to do that. Let's really get focused on it. And so the next step then is really to go through the process of bringing those goals down throughout the organization. So if you're going to one of the things I wanted to manage is it's kind of an interesting study to look at the difference between strategy and tactics. And we went through this a lot in a couple of the companies that I worked with. And to tell you, and I did a lot of study on this on the internet over the last few days. And I don't think there's a consensus of a good definition between strategy and tactics. But the strategy to me is basically, how are we going to do, or what are we going to do? And the tactics then become, how are we going to do it? Who's going to be involved? And what departments have to execute X, Y, and Z? So after you've defined your SMART goals at the executive level, then it's time to go to the next level of management. So for instance, if you're international, you'll want to look at all the various areas of the world and see how they can participate in the new goals that were set. If you're looking at a particular sales goal, then you'll want to go down to the district managers and eventually to the individual salespeople, and integrate these SMART goals into every individual's goals within the corporation. Here I'm using sales as an example, but this could be manufacturing, this could be finance, this could be also IT. Everybody's going to have to participate in a certain way to reach that goal, and they have to be aligned. Does that make sense? I see a couple heads nodding and one not so much. So, but now what we're talking about, everybody being on the same page, is how are we going to go forward working together to achieve the new goals of the corporation? So again, whether we're talking about strategic goals or tactical goals, I'll go back to the sales example. How are we going to grow our business by 50%? And what do we need to work on? Is it prospecting? Is it building relationships? Is it IT and building a new call center? Is it product training? Do we need to get the salespeople more trained on product? Is it sales training? Just basic, the to-dos on sales. Do we have to teach them how to be better closers or customer service operators? And this should really boil down to then a performance review kind of approach of how do we help our salespeople or anybody in manufacturing or any other department in the company become more productive and become better equipped to achieve the goals that we've put in front of them. And again, in some of my previous companies, the performance review was a once a year type of thing and a big surprise, and everybody was nervous and uncomfortable, especially the boomer generation, I think is the worst at this, but here I am. But it shouldn't be like that. We should really have weekly talks with all of our employees and have a real time set every week. So here's where we get together. We talk about what you're doing in terms of achieving your goals and what you need and where are you having trouble and where are your obstacles and such. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a formal agenda, especially if you do this every week. Your employees will know pretty much what the agenda is. And for getting down then to an annual performance review, we are talking about performance management, there won't be any big surprises at the end of that. And okay, so one of the things that I have liked to do is when I look at an employee's performance is focus on 3 characteristics that I really admire about the person. And that's pretty easy to do. Most of the people I've worked with are great people, but we all have strengths and areas where we can grow. Let's put it like that. I don't like to use the term weaknesses. And so, yeah, let's focus on the 3 areas that I really appreciate about a particular person, and then 3 places that, if improved, it would lead the employee to greater success. And I want to tell you about a story when I was a sales manager, and we had a session, and basically what I wanted to do is have each one of the salespeople, and at that point they were all women, which is kind of neither here nor there, I guess, but get in front of the rest of the sales force and say, here's what I do really well. Here's what I'm really proud of about my sales process. And the first one got up and took about 2 minutes. I don't really know. And then the next one got up and said, I can't do this. And they started filling in for each other. And they started saying, what I really admire about you is your ability to prospect, or your ability to close, or, you build such great relationships with the customers. And that was really a turning point. And my sales team after that was always number 1, because we really learned how to leverage each other's strengths, even though we had different product lines and different territories and things like that. We worked together as a team, which is kind of unusual in a sales group when they're geographically separated and things. But so again, the performance review, if you improve these 3 things, how would it lead to greater success? And when you look at your peers, that's easier to kind of define of what do I admire about these folks? What can I learn from them? Okay, so I'm going to hand it over now to Chris.
Okay, don't listen to me. I'm just kidding. Share. No, pause. Just a few minutes before, in case internet is challenged. I'm here in chat so that we can ask questions. as well as a personal photo of an upcoming wedding that I'm using project management strategies to do, as well as a little business I have, which is officiating other people's weddings. So project management is something I use all the time, and I'm excited today to share a little bit about my system and hopefully give you some tips and ways to think about developing your own system as well. So as we do the next slide, the first thing to remember is my system is not your system. So I'll talk a little bit about my system, but if you take anything away from this, the idea would be to upgrade your own system using some of these things that resonate with you or work with your own style and the system that you're working within, not to try to copy necessarily somebody else's system, because we can spend a lot of time trying on different systems, and sometimes it's just analog what you have. So these are some screenshots of what I use. I use Trello.com with some Gmail integration. And on these two screenshots, you'll see that I use either a simple Trello board or a Trello board enhanced with some what they call cards that add some images. It's essentially a way to visualize your projects from left to right. And what I do is, for the second bullet point I have there, is I do time blocking. So I put a lot of time for a project.
Just so we can, let's, sorry for the glitches, and we're all working together to make sure we can get this one right. But yeah, we want to make sure we can share Rachel's slides. Chris, do you mind sharing them? Or okay.
I was confused because before I thought that it was showing this
kind of
video.
means for me. I put here a couple photos that show some projects.
Okay, that looks like it's working.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
No worries, Chris. It looked like, yeah, Rachel's face took over, which is great.
My name is Christensen, and recording this just a few minutes before in case internet is challenged. I'm here in chat so that we can ask questions as this is going on, but wanted to just share a little bit about what project management kind of means for me. I put here a couple photos that show some projects I've managed that have been in the education space around the sustainable development goals involving university students, as well as a personal photo of an upcoming wedding that I'm using project management strategies to do, as well as a little business I have, which is officiating other people's weddings. So project management is something I use all the time, and I'm excited today to share a little bit about my system and hopefully give you some tips and ways to think about developing your own system as well. So as we do the next slide, the first thing to remember is my system is not your system. So I'll talk a little bit about my system, but if you take anything away from this, the idea would be to upgrade your own system using some of these things that resonate with you or work with your own style and the system that you're working within, not to try to copy necessarily somebody else's system, because we can spend a lot of time trying on different systems, and sometimes it's just good to upgrade the analog what you have. So these are some screenshots of what I use. I use Trello.com with some Gmail integration. And on these two screenshots, you'll see that I use either a simple Trello board or a Trello board enhanced with some what they call cards that add some images. It's essentially a way to visualize your projects from left to right. And what I do is, for the second bullet point I have there, is I do time blocking. So I put a lot of time for a project based on how much I think that it will take. And then I schedule the meetings onto my Trello. So if I have 3 meetings in one day, then I'll know that I only have, maybe 3 hours to get the projects done. So I'll schedule them in time blocks, usually in 25-minute increments, either 25-minute or hour increments. And then I schedule in breaks to make sure that I stretch, make sure that I eat, make sure that I kind of start and end at reasonable times. So that's time blocking. I use Pomodoro, which is something I have a link to later, as well as Kanban. These are ways to visualize your projects from left to right, starting in sort of Japanese manufacturing origin story for the Kanban approach. And the Pomodoro is an approach that's sort of been adapted that then allots projects 25-minute periods to get certain things done. And certainly later I'll talk a little bit about, there's often times when you need much more than 25 minutes and can't really put a time limit on stuff, especially when it's deep work or thinking time. But when it's sort of like checking your email a couple times a day to make sure you don't only check your email but get other things done, 25-minute timers is something I use to just make sure I don't let certain tasks take longer than I have time for. What I try to remind myself for this fourth bullet point is swallow the frog first. So do the most important things or the hardest things, the things that have the most value if you get them done, but are the easiest to put off. Do those things first, ideally before 10 a.m. That's because, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, because my best time to work is about 8 to 10 in the morning, and then again from about 4 to 6 in the afternoon, or sort of my best thinking time. So I try to get the more important projects done there. And then the columns I have from left to right are to do, which is the long list of things I have to do, things that are scheduled for this week. Try to be reasonable. Often I will admit the list that I make for myself for 1 week, or actually what I make for myself for one day, are actually things that can be more reasonably accomplished in 1 week. So there's often lots of resorting there. And then I have a column for today, and then next, and then now. And then the really important piece is there's only ever one thing in the now column. So you can only really focus on one thing really well at a time. So I only have one thing in the now, only one thing in the next, and then to do, and for the week schedule can have more things. I try not to have more than 8 things scheduled for a day. And then I just have a last piece, which is celebrate the things when you move them to done, celebrate them and capture the learning. I often take about 5 minutes at the end of the day to do what I call kind of a daily examine or daily reflection, both about sort of the emotional ups and downs of the workday, as well as things I learned or could do better the next day in terms of productivity. So that's sort of my system. So I would suggest, sort of analyze your own environment, the project, and then your project team. So, it's really important to remember project management, that it's the practice of leading work of a team or yourself to achieve goals within particular constraints, which we'll talk about in the next bullet point, are scope, time, quality, and budget. And then the 4 things to consider as project manager is the plan that you put in place, which they recommend you, particularly if something is a little bit more repeatable, you spend more time planning and then doing in many cases, and then that makes the work easier. If something is unpredictable or sort of chaotic, then you may want to take more of a lean or agile approach, which has more learning and built-in check-ins rather than an evolved plan. So plan, process, people, and power. And power has to do with how the hierarchy is organized so that the work gets done. So we'll talk a little bit about RACI chart in a second. And then there's certainly different approaches, project, product versus process-based. And so there are a couple ways to assess your team. I've got a link here for later analysis of the RACI chart, but horizontal and vertical analysis. So when you RACI starts for responsible, accountable, and then somebody who is consulted and somebody is informed. Those are the acronyms for RACI, and that's just a chart that I highly recommend if you're not familiar with that you look at. That way to organize your team, as well as doing some analysis. So if you do a horizontal and vertical analysis, essentially you're asking the RACI chart the questions: is there too much work for one person to do? More than that is reasonable? Or are there too many hands or too many cooks in the kitchen to get something done? Are you spending all of your time communicating? So those 2 analyses are really helpful to kind of see if a project has too many people that need to be consulted or informed versus too few people or too many people accountable or responsible. And then assess your work environment. Again, I mentioned agile and lean as different approaches, particularly helpful if your environment is a little bit more, collaborative, ever-changing, whereas there's some other approaches that are better if you have a more predictable or consistent work environment to do the project in. And then also ask yourself, how permitted is your sort of environment, or how allowable is risk, failure, learning? And those will also kind of inform which you choose. So I'll just put 2 links. I really highly recommend looking at the slides later, but 2 friends in San Diego, 2 San Diegans that you can learn a lot more from about these topics. Pam is another SBDC advisor and friend, and has a really interesting challenge about productivity. You can sign up for it on her website. And Lindsay Lachelle is a brand and marketing expert in San Diego, also a friend, and lots of projects with her. And diamondandbranch.com, that link right there has a link to best ways to delegate and provide accountability with her SEAT method for a team. Highly recommend those strategies for delegation. And then these are some just rules of thumb, again, for later kind of checking out. The next slide has more resources. But I would recommend your natural clock. When is the best time for you to do deep work, thinking work? When's your best working versus thinking time? And then when do you hit fatigue? When is your decision fatigue? When you just can't really make any more big decisions. You may want to make decisions earlier in the day. Sometimes I will decide what I'm going to do the next day, the night before, just so that I can kind of execute the next day rather than making decisions. And then there's a discernment piece. Do you touch something once and do it now, or do you schedule time to do it later when it requires more thinking or collaboration? And there's a discerning when to delegate something versus doing it yourself. And then scheduling. So time blocking is a strategy that I talked about, but many people without time blocking will also schedule time for deep work, or sometimes they call it thinking time. They schedule management time or supervision time, either for themselves or for others. And then some people schedule breakout time, which is some time to kind of, get out of the office, if you will, and try to get some clarity on some things that take more strategic thinking. And then share out time. That's something I schedule for myself to make sure that, I don't only do the work, but I also share it out with colleagues or share it out on LinkedIn to make sure that other people are aware of the work and can tune in and connect as that makes sense for them. And then these last 3 sections is just training. So training other people on your communication preferences, whether that be by email, your response time, or your preferred communication method, and then training yourself on your system and then sticking with it so that you can improve it. And then some tips around leading better meetings. I would suggest on the next couple slides, some shorter, briefer meetings, like the Scrum approach is a good one. Stand-up meetings is another way to call it. Better delegation, and then modeling better vacation or breaks for the rest of the team. And then constant learning as an attitude, and then upgrading your existing system, which you can do with these tools without having to abandon the system and create a new one. So would love to sort of just share some future reading. On the left-hand side, I've got some tools and approaches to read about around task prioritization, project visualization. Again, I mentioned the Kanban, a more traditional version of that would have been the Gantt chart. Either way, you sort of visualize how long a project will take, what's next, what the time horizons look like. And then personal team productivity. I read a lot of Trello blogs. Again, I mentioned my friend Lindsay's seat delegation. Highly recommend downloading that kit, how to delegate a task. Even if you're delegating a task to yourself, it's a really good approach to ask the necessary questions to make sure you understand the scope and the constraints before and check-in time. And then highly recommend a former session of the Pivot series by Lauren, a colleague on the call today, about her Agile family and just the Agile approach. So there's a link to that YouTube recording as well. And then if you want to try some tools, I've linked to RACI. I'll put a couple more links in here before we circulate the slides, but the RACI, the Gantt chart, how to do time blocking with Pomodoro, or the Kanban approach. I'll link to Scrum, and then a couple tools around email. So I have recently been experimenting with snoozing certain emails until I'm able to deal with them, to just kind of limit the mind clutter. And then certainly unsubscribing to things that are no longer relevant, or are kind of taking up that precious time at the beginning of the day when you go through emails, just spending kind of deleting ones that you never look at. So I kind of do an audit every once in a while and unsubscribe there. So kind of in summary, project managers develop and utilize for people or their space or their goals. And a project is a temporary endeavor to produce a unique product or service or result within a defined beginning and end, usually to change a process or a product or to create added value. So the temporary nature of the project is in contrast with a business as usual, sometimes we call operations, where a process is needed. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Curt.
Wow, that was great. In fact, I'd like to volunteer. I think the goal of every presentation like this is to get people to say, hey, I would like to learn more. And that's definitely where I'm at right now. Hey, I would like to learn more. And if anybody wants to turn this into a single, 50-minute presentation or whatever, I would be really interested in joining that. Can you hear me?
Yes, Curt. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Same here. There are a lot of great nuggets of things. It definitely made me think about what are my best times, and what, Rachel sounds like she did a great job figuring out when she's most productive for different types of work.
Well, I know that.
That's such a cool thing, right? To go and really analyze yourself and go, how am I going to be most successful with my days? So
yes.
that, and then Curt, do you know the Pomodoro method?
Since I was in 8th grade, I need a nap every day. I just do. I mean, I don't get to do it, but I know between 1:30 and 3 or something like that, I'm pretty useless. And if I go and read, just lay down and I'll get up a lot more energized and be more productive for the rest of the day. So
You belong in Europe, Curt. That sounds
But-
like the afternoon siesta.
I don't know. There's something about my metabolism, but that's just the way I am, and I recognize that. But I think all the tools that Rachel was talking about too are, it's when I see all these tools, they look kind of complicated, but what Rachel demonstrated is when you work with them in an orchestrated fashion, they can work together and make you more productive. And I'd really like to explore that idea. So, okay, shall we?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we talked about project management. I always look at project management as when a company goes about a project, it's focusing on something that they've never done before. And process management, on the other hand, is about things that you do routinely. And this is a really important aspect of management, especially as you get bigger. And so, for instance, I just mapped out kind of a process here where a salesperson will forecast an order. Manufacturing has to order the parts, or I've worked in instrumentation companies, so manufacturing has to order the parts. They need to schedule assembly. Somebody needs to know that they need to ship and where they need to ship it to, and then finance and IT know that they have to know that they need to bill this customer. And so these kind of processes build up over time in a company. And generally, when you start out as a startup with 2 or 3 or 4 people, and all of a sudden you hit it big and now you have 100 people, you get this, which can lead to chaos. Meaning there is no process, just everybody is doing their own thing and trying to get everybody else to do their own thing and giving, but there's no overall process, and it can lead to chaos. I hope that makes sense to everybody, and the faster you grow, the more chaos you're probably going to get if you don't get a hold of how do we actually do things? How do we actually go about doing our work on a day-to-day basis? Look, where'd that come from? So I couldn't resist. I mean, probably most of you are too young to remember Get Smart, but and they did have, the good guys were on the team of control, and the bad guys were on the team of chaos. And I was looking at a couple of these videos yesterday, and they're still hysterical. I couldn't believe it. But that's the choice that we have when we look at process management. So, oh man, I think I lost a couple. I lost a couple slides. So, what I think for me, what's important about process management is that, of course, it saves time and it saves energy and it saves money to have good processes defined. But what's most important is, I think, the processes that companies use are the main factors of dissatisfaction of employees within a company. Every time there's a handoff between one department and another department on some kind of process, if they don't clearly understand all of the steps in that process, they will become frustrated. Everybody will become frustrated. And I'll give you an example of one particular situation where I was working with people in the Bay Area in the sales administration, and people in Atlanta who were into distribution. And they were totally frustrated with each other. They didn't like each other. It led to great amounts of dissatisfaction in their jobs. And getting them all together and having them describe what their SMART goals are, what they need to do, what they need to have, and letting them describe that to each other. The situation completely changed. As soon as I understood everybody else's jobs and goals, they're like, oh, now I get it. So how do we change this process to make it work better for all of us? And so I think, if we look at performance management, project management, and process management, those are three of the areas where we can really improve our performance in companies and become more effective. Of course, we didn't talk about financial management today, which is another big piece of the puzzle, but I'm sure we will someday. So, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Curt. I'd love to open it up to some questions. And again, it's kind of a small group today, but if Petros or Mike or Eric, if you guys have any questions, we'd love to, we've got a little time to actually have a discussion on any of these topics. And I know that Curt and Rachel threw a lot of different ideas at you. So feel free to come off mute and ask away.
I don't know if my internet's good, but I'd be curious to hear some other systems people use or any problems you have. We probably have some time to workshop a quick problem, and also would like to welcome Eric. I think it's the Eric G that I worked with in my last role, so welcome, Eric. So be curious to hear any suggestions or any problems you're trying to solve. I bet between us we could probably come up with a good experiment to try.
Like to know more about the Pomodoro. That seems something interesting. If you could tell me more about it.
Yeah, I'll start, and then if my internet's cut out, I know Lauren can talk to it too. But essentially what I do is there's this thing called, I think it's like tomatoclock.com, like Pomodoro tomatoes sort of thing. And so the idea is you can just set a 25-minute timer. I use that. And it has 25 minutes, it has 10 minutes, it has 5 minutes. And so you're supposed to build in some breaks for yourself, like a stretch break, 5 minutes, or walk around the block, 10 minutes, or something like that, so that you can kind of get your brain working better. And then do 25-minute sprints of work. And so it works really well. Like I try to do it when I'm trying to get my inbox down. Like I'll do 25 minutes in the morning, afternoon, and evening, and try not to do more than that because I could just spend my whole day on email easily. Or I'll do it for things like I got to get this like packaged for my boss or something like that. Like anything that like I just don't want to take on my whole day. It doesn't work super well for me for anything that's like really thinking oriented. So I don't set like a 25-minute timer for myself to like strategize something or something where it's like I have no idea how long it's going to take me to think through it. So that's sort of the approach, and there's some different strategy or some different theories out there about like what the right amount of time is, but they've done some study about the human brain in terms of how long it can focus on a task, and it takes you like 10 minutes to kind of get into it, scope it, and then maybe 15 minutes to do it. So it's like kind of about a right size of a task, and Lauren and others might be able to add something more about that too.
Yeah, I use it in the same way, Rachel, where like actually I create my own kind of personal Brink like update email that I spend some time actually, coming up with what are some things I want to share with my clients, what are some events going on, what are some grants you should know about, that kind of thing. But I do Pomodoro method on that because I force myself to finish it, within that 25-minute block. And then taking that break is really good for like resetting my mind and going, okay, that's done. I can celebrate that, moving on. But yeah, I don't want things like that taking up more than 25 minutes. So it's great for one of those tasks that you can focus and pump up out that time. I agree. I don't know that I would use it for strategic thinking where I don't want that time pressure kind of over me. But yeah, it's you buy like a tomato clock, like kitchen timer, and just set that up next to you. It's pretty cool. Anybody else use Pomodoro?
It's pretty obvious to me that there's certain people in the room who do not suffer from ADD, because I can work an hour and virtually touch 60 different projects. And I've been doing that since, for 40 years. and that ain't gonna change. That's you know, I have, and for strategic projects, I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they're just kind of, you know, grinding away in my brain. So um, I don't know. That may be a curse. It may be a blessing. It's probably both, but I can't imagine. Sometimes I can sit down for 25 minutes or an hour on a single project, but not very often.
That's also an interesting part of it. We're all different, and we got to figure out what works for us. I think I appreciated that part of Rachel's slide, that she's like, this is my system, maybe not your system, but here's different methods.
Yeah, it's things eventually get done, but Misty will tell you how organized I am in my thinking, I'm sure.
Misty, are you still on? Any comments on your system or any reactions? I think we lost Misty. You're on mute. All right, Rachel, I see you're back, but we know your internet's spotty. Mike or Petros, any comments on this or questions?
Yeah, I had a question. So, and maybe this was just from like rote practice, but how did you figure out what your best thinking times were? And what do you do in the times that are not your best thinking times? Like what work do you reserve for those times where you still have to be working, but you recognize that it's not your best thinking time?
Yeah, this one for me. I'll try to do it, and then I bet other people have answers. How's my sound? Okay.
Pardon?
Yeah, so I'll share for me, and then I think other people probably have figured this out. In terms of the first part of the question, best time, I kind of noticed that I like to work Fridays from like 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. And then I was like, oh, I'm kind of doing that for evenings too. And it wasn't because I'm a workaholic necessarily. It was like, oh, that's like my best thinking time. And so I kind of started reorienting my start time and end time and break time, realizing that like later afternoon, I was like really cranking on things like the doing, the implementation part. And then thinking or swallowing the frog, I was like, well, I just feel better. Like my emotions are better if I get those things done at the beginning of the day. You just kind of start feeling like you're getting some wins. So some of it was just observation where my energy was higher and where I was like just, yeah. So I didn't really have a scientific method of just observing it. I just sort of realized after a couple of years. I had a boss one time ask me when my best time was, and I was like, I have no idea. So I just started paying attention when he asked me. And then the time that's not my best time, it's like still work time. It's just not my best thinking time or my best doing time. So I usually leave that for responsive tasks. So like responding to inquiries or emails or anything where it's like a little bit more second nature to me, but other people might need help with something or might need to give somebody a resource or give them access to a Google Drive or something like that. So a little bit more of that kind of thing. Or I use that time to sort tasks for the following day, but not necessarily have to be making decisions. So I just try to leave my like good decision discernment time reserved for that quality times a day, and then do other tasks such as what I just mentioned during the other time, the filler. I bet this call has some other solutions to that same question too, Mike.
Yeah, can I comment on that? Number one, I don't. Probably most people in the room don't know what swallowing the frog means.
Go ahead and give it a good definition then, Curt.
Yeah, I got the book here, but but you might want to explain what that means.
Well, I think it was wrongly accredited to Twain, right, as a quote, but essentially like the quote was something like swallow the frog first thing in the morning before
Right.
breakfast, and then everything is downhill after there. I'm messing up the quote. You'll be able to say it better, but that's essentially the gist of it.
Yeah, it's just get the stuff you don't want to do out of the way first. Is the way I understand it, but.
Go ahead,
Mine on
Curt.
that.
If you weren't going to share something else to Mike's question, go ahead.
No, I'm good for now.
Yeah, my swallowing the frog is getting my workout done first thing. because if I can get that over, it motivates me for the rest of the day. But I also, one of the things I appreciate, Rachel, of one of the tips you shared was actually scheduling the break time and making sure you have that time, that refresh time. I know when I worked, I used to work for a big consulting firm where it was churn and burn style, meaning we worked 80 to 90-hour weeks. And, you know, I would sleep under my desk kind of thing. It was bad, right? So coming out of that and having to retrain myself on, well, am I working productively? How do I figure out that time and how do I give myself breaks? I force myself to schedule them, and I still do that. So there's blocks of times where I know I have to get outside, and if I don't, it's going to hurt me later on. And the same with sleep. I've learned the importance of sleep over the time and making sure, like, I have to get 8 hours or I'm not going to be productive. I used to say, oh, like I'm a workaholic, I can do this, like 3 hours, I'm up, great. But reflecting back on it, knowing that like that wasn't really maintainable. So
totally, and it's the same with all the biological things. So I very rarely sacrifice sleep, so that's not a problem for me. But I forget to eat and drink water, use the restroom, walk. Like I forget to do those things. Stretch, stand up. I have a stand-up desk, so like those are things that I schedule in standing up, and I schedule in sitting down, and I schedule in drinking water.
Wow. Do you just have like a little reminder that says stand up, Rachel? Cool.
Do you guys care if I share something?
Please go for it, Misty.
I've been a fan of 12-week year stuff for a long time, and it gives some suggestions on how to schedule your calendar. So can you see my calendar? Am I sharing?
Yes.
So this is a couple of weeks ago, and I have these things that are scheduled every day. They're called buffer blocks, but I have reminders in here. So when I adhere to this set of rules that are on my calendar, life is better for everybody. I'm nicer to Chris and Rachel, nicer to consulting team. I'm more responsive, and I get a whole lot more done. And hopefully you can see this, like I've got this, it's defined here. So it's 2 hours of time that I schedule at the, an hour at the beginning, an hour at the end of the day. And this is just for me to knock out email and those kinds of things. And when I honor this, the world is better. And then I also have this one on my calendar, which is borrowed from David Allen's Getting Things Done. So it's a review and plan on Monday morning. So I have a quick reminder of how the GTD process works. You collect, process, organize, review, and do. And then a set of standing priorities, like what am I going to identify as my standing priorities for the week? So that's another one. And then I put every other week, I put a 3-hour, can you guys still see I'm changing these around? Every other week I put a 3-hour block called a breakout block on my calendar. And the goal here, I don't do this as often as I should. And usually this is time that gets borrowed for other things, but a breakout block is designed to step out of the work, the regular work, and go do something else. So for me, that's learn to surf or take an archery class or take a cooking class or do something totally unwork related so that my head can unbind from it and do something slightly new and interesting.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure.
Would like washing your clothes fit into that, or is it just really outside interests?
I try, if I do this well, it's me trying to learn something new.
Okay.
Which uses some different part of my brain and then gives me the ability, like it's usually in the middle when I honor this, it's in the middle or within a day of when I do this, problems that I've been really struggling with get solved, right? Like I have these like, sometimes, pretty close to this. I have an aha moment. And then this is the one that I also, I have one other block that I put on the calendar every week, a 3-hour block of a strategic block. So if there's a piece of work that's been hanging out there that I need to work on, like Rachel and I have been working on a fundraising strategy that has all this sponsorship stuff. At some point that ended up in this 3-hour block. And I shut off everything else and I just worked that project for 3 straight hours, with no breaks and no interruptions. And that, that helps me move something big, several steps ahead. So those are all just some sort of a combination of, and I think part of that's borrowed from the 12-week year, I think. If it's not that, then it's from getting things done or from the 4 disciplines of execution. Those seem to be my favorite productivity hacks.
So that, I think what we're talking about now is more time management, right? Is that correct?
Partly, but for me, it's also being able to fit in the big strategic stuff and to take enough time away to allow myself to be creative.
Well, what I've heard from you and Rachel, to me, is like, this would really be helpful for me to learn more and take a deeper dive into what you folks are doing in terms of both the tools you use to organize yourselves as well as the discipline. Good luck with that, Curt. But the discipline that you have to, schedule things out weeks in advance or a week in advance and say, next Monday I'm gonna finish this project, or spend 3 hours on pushing it along. So just a suggestion, Lauren.
Great. Yeah, I'm certainly learning a lot about that. And I know that as I've talked to clients who are struggling with fitting in the strategic stuff, I go back to Covey's time management in terms of looking at the quadrants of like, seems like we're only focusing on Q1, which is like, this is urgent, important. And if that's what fills up our calendar day in and day out, we miss Q2, which is not urgent, not as urgent, but important. And those are often those planning activities, the real strategic thinking that needs to happen. And so, I mean, the lesson that I just saw from Misty is like, she blocks out some serious amounts of time. And I know how busy that calendar is. You guys just saw a preview of a week. Like, that's tough to block things out. So you have to force it through a calendar. But yeah, getting to even stepping back, and that's one of those activities I like to do periodically, is stepping back and even listing out, what am I doing that's Q1 versus Q2, looking at Q3, the things that are urgent but not so important, and how do I manage those better? And then am I doing anything that's not urgent, not important, that, is just time wasting, and how do I try to eliminate that as much as possible? So it's kind of good to just use that. And I use it from time to time to take inventory of what I'm doing, but some people use it. And again, it depends on what system works for you. Some people use that to actually organize their time every week. Chris, how about you? Do you have any systems like, sorry, Curt, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, again, what Rachel was talking about, that everybody is going to have a different system. Usually when we have presentations, it's like, here's how you should do things. But I think in this case, it's better, here's how I do things. Is there anything here you can apply to how you do things? And I think that would be a real helpful session. And I think you had just asked Chris to...
Yeah, I was asking Chris, and I know we only have about a minute left, but Chris, anything, can we hear about your system?
Oh man, I'm trying to reconfigure it actually. And it's interesting because I find myself that the hardest times are transitional times. So when I have a method that's pretty good, but then I want to improve it, I tinker with it, it kind of all falls apart as then I'm trying to rebuild something new. But I found that for me, one of the major things that's consistent that helps me be efficient is making sure that when I create a calendar event or something for myself, that I include links to documents, if they're Google documents or what have you. So no matter what it is, I'm only a click away from getting right into being productive. I almost never sort through folders. I have my bookmarks organized in Chrome. Obviously, any browser works just fine for that. So just things that I limit the transition in between. So, because I have a hard time recalibrating for sure. I'm also looking into more of these methodologies that Rachel and you have mentioned for Trello. And another thing, I love automation. So getting cards to link from one board to another, things like that, I also find tremendously valuable. It's a little bit more complicated, but if you're somebody who's willing to look into those, there are a lot of tools that go one step further to automate your own organization process.
Great. Any final comments or questions from anyone? I think we're at the top of the hour. Thank you guys for participating today, and appreciate everyone's ideas and help. I'm going to definitely dig into some of these new ones too. So thank you all.